Suspense. I'm watching the live page, so I'll tell you when it comes into action. Yeah, we're there. Cool. Watching the live page, so I'll tell you when it comes into action. Just heard myself. Okay. So I'm going to wait maybe just a minute while a few people join. I don't know how many people are joining. We can't tell. We don't mind. We're together, and we're going to have a nice hour talking together. I guess I'll begin to introduce myself. I'm John Bingham-Hall. I'm director of Theatrum Mundi, and also one of the many people who have contributed and kind of co-organized this project, The City Talks Back. Sorry, 1 second. City Talks Back is a project initiated by Onassis Cultural Center, Onassis Stegi in Athens, and also by Theatrum Mundi. And it's a research and kind of creative residency, 2 research and creative residencies that we ran in Athens the beginning of this year, just before lockdown. In fact, spanning slightly just into as the first lockdown in Athens was beginning. But fortunately, we could all gather together and spend 2 week-long sessions thinking together about voices, about the ways that the city or architecture or urban space or all of also the technologies and spaces that make up the city stage voice, transform it into political voice, and how the city kind of develops its own languages or its own positions and kind of speaks back and transforms actually what we say, coming from an article of Saskia Sassen's asking, does the city have speech? That's where this phrase, the city talks back, came from. And one of the artists we invited to visit Athens and work in Athens on this project was Mercedes Azpilicueta. And she invited to work with her, Angeliki Tzortzakaki and Maria Sideri, who are both here as well. And we're going to talk about the project that these 3 people have done together, but also link it into some bigger questions that are asked by the City Talks Back, and I suppose also to look at how this kind of creation, this kind of creative experimentation can raise or indeed address and kind of be a microcosm of very important questions that we're trying to pose about urban life and about the politics of living together and narrating and having agency, political agency within the city. So what we're going to do in the next hour or so is we'll talk a bit about the work that Mercedes and Angeliki and Maria have done together, and also the kind of crafts and the issues and the experiences behind making that particular work. And then we're going to kind of, in the middle, take a little break to actually read a script that was part of the work, part of the project, to hear some reading of part of that script that was developed by Mercedes and Angeliki and performed by Maria. And I'm also going to kind of share a reading as well that then kind of links that script into, again, some of these questions that we'll raise and that I'll go on just now to kind of elaborate a little bit more on. And then we'll kind of, we'll link that into a bigger discussion. Unfortunately, there's no chat for this. There's no interaction. So we kind of invite you to think, reflect, write to us, tweet to us, communicate with us. But in this setting, there's no kind of back and forth, unfortunately. So just to kind of raise or flesh out these questions a bit more, what kind of was a a starting point for me in this whole kind of theme that Theatrum Mundi has been developing around the political voice is how we can start with questions about cities that start with sound, not as a kind of object that already exists, but as a kind of critical framework. And that kind of raised that's been something we've been investigating for a while, and that raised for me a question of the voice as a really kind of central sonic experience, central sonic modality in the city, and its relationship to urban infrastructures, and how certain kinds of infrastructure stage the voice in ways that it kind of is heard within the public sphere, that it becomes something more than our kind of everyday speech. It becomes part of political discourse, say, or law even, or kind of public debate. What is it? What kind of mechanisms and spaces do that? I'm very interested in debates about free speech and about platforming. But one thing in those kind of debates about free speech is that they often treat individuals in isolation, that we speak, we have a voice as an individual, and it's about kind of, well, they don't take account for the kind of ways that different people have access to different infrastructures that allow their speech, different resources that allow their speech to take on this kind of power almost, or this agency that we might start to call it political speech with a big P. All speech can be political, of course, but how is it? So, you know, going from this notion that if everyone just spoke, it would be this kind of open marketplace of ideas, but it's not level. There's not enough account taken of those kind of underlying processes and infrastructures that create that inequality of speech and agency. Everyone speaks, of course, whether directly through their vocal cords, whether through technologies, whether through embodied action, different forms of voice that may come through different forms of ability. But the discussion that we should be having, as I said, is around the kind of distribution, the development of processes that help us hear one another, that help us value voices, that help sustain people's ability to narrate their own experience. And in Mercedes' work, Mercedes and I have known each other for quite a few years now, and we've done quite a lot of experiments together, from the two of us and a couple of other people kind of in a small workshop to making work together for an exhibition last year, which was very much around testing the acoustics of infrastructure spaces in Rotterdam with staged actions. And then I obviously wanted to invite Mercedes to be part of this project. And there's a particular kind of mechanism within your work, which I think is so fascinating, as a question about how we hear one another, because you work a lot with hearing, recording, but then kind of translating speech that you may or may not fully understand into your own speech, translating other people's speech into your own speech. And it kind of makes me think of, if we think about hearing each other's voices, we typically think about listening to a recording, or directly we think about reading. But this poses a really interesting question around speaking someone else's words as a way to hear them and be in kind of connection with them. And that then raises the question of the script as a kind of medium for passing voice from one person to another, and developing a kind of distributed or collective voice, which really comes up in the reading that I'm going to share later. So on that thought, I kind of wanted to pass over to you all to talk a bit about the work you made for the City Talks Back together in Athens, and some of the questions that came up in terms of how you encountered, recorded, dealt with voices in the city, and what questions you were addressing.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you, Theatrum Mundi, and Angeliki, and Maria also for being here today. And well, the three of us are very happy for the invitation from Theatrum Mundi to, yeah, of course, to share with the audience, and yeah, and of course have this conversation with you, John. So indeed, as a visual artist myself, language and voice and soundscapes and, yeah, Though all those elements are usually part of my work, of the different projects that I get involved with. And as you said, we have done several things together, but this particular invitation in Athens was something special because, of course, my first idea was to engage with the sound of the city and to engage with with, let's say, noisy areas that could where I could extract an amount of material or collect an amount of material that later on could be translated and performed by human voices, let's say. But next to that, of course, there is a whole infrastructure, which is language in itself, in this case, Greek. And Angeliki and I, we know each other for a few years already. We share a lot of interests around language, queer and feminist studies, feminist collective practices, etc. And and I know also Maria's work already for a long time, because both of us, we have worked around the figure of Valentine de Saint-Point, another female artist and performer and dancer from the early 20th century. So I've been following Maria's work for a long time. Both Angeliki and Maria are from Greece, and then I thought, well, this is just a fantastic opportunity to join forces and see what we can do. And indeed, through Theatrum Mundi and Onassis Stegi and the City Talks Back, we did a series of residencies. First, I went myself to the city. It was a very interesting, immersive experience into this particular place. It really reminds me of the city of Buenos Aires, where I lived more than a decade. And maybe later we can speak a bit with both of you. Where do we find these connections, these similar features when it comes to, of course, I'm always referring to soundscapes and what we hear and how that sometimes is interconnected to how the society is built, constructed, how that is connected to gender issues, or sometimes certain neighborhood identities or communities, features, and in general, I think that I thought, okay, when I was in Athens already, I've been there before, but being with the whole group, with the City Talks Back, it was really putting all our attention into what we were hearing, and surrounded by a group of architects, artists, musicians. For me, it was really a very interdisciplinary experience that really enhanced my own experience as a visual artist. So it was quite a learning experience, and that was January this year, not just before the pandemic. The pandemic was already here, but we just didn't know. We were mingling around the city just before the burst out, here in Europe, I would say. Angeliki went, I think, early March herself, and I will give you the word to you so you can tell more about it. But the thing is, the first step was about visiting different locations in the city, a lot of markets, which is something that I have done already in the city of Rotterdam, where I lived for more than 4 years, and also in Buenos Aires in a particular neighborhood. So it's always looking for places where, like a market, where a lot of relationships, mainly economic and generational and gender relationships, are intertwined or intermingled. Is that a word? So that was the first step, collecting and Angeliki, maybe you can tell a bit about that also, that you were the...
Thank you, Mercedes. Can you all hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, John, for the invitation, and Theatrum Mundi and Onassis, of course. Yes, so actually, I think sometimes we should really look into coincidences in life and how things are interconnected. So I've been having a lot of trust on these things lately. So when I received this invitation from Mercedes already, I don't remember, in January, maybe when you first went to Athens or a little bit earlier, I can say I was extremely excited because for the first time I would be able to go back to Athens and then use my tools somehow, or like make something out of it. And I'm saying that because I've lived in Athens from 2008 to 2014, beginning of 15, which were very significant years for the city also, because of all the social and political movements, upheavals, riots that you all know. So yeah, the possibility to go back and work with a soundscape, but also work with women's words was something that little, sparked on me. But at the same time, I have to admit, I felt a little bit intimidated because I knew that I was the one understanding the language. So as Mercedes said, also we have been having a lot of common interests, so that we communicate also in a certain way and we understand each other very well. And that was, of course, very helpful. But the fact that I had to deal with a material that only I could understand at that certain moment where I was doing the recordings, I think came along with a great responsibility. And that because, of course, what we did before a little bit of a preparation work when we were both in Amsterdam in Mercedes studio was the outline of the work and our, let's say, methodology and the formats that would be developed around the script. And then together with that, I developed or I looked in some locations that would be interesting to record. And of course, the main location was the market, the main market of Athens in Athinas Street, which connects also two main squares, Monastiraki and Ammonia Square. And this is, of course, the central market, but this was also the place, and I hope I'm not saying something completely wrong, but it was the first, it was the area where the first theater was born after the constitution of the Greek state in the end of 19th century. So on the one hand, it's the city as a theater, Theatrum Mundi, and on the other side, we had this metaphorical and literal stage where we would work on. Yeah, so let's say our focus area was the market, but I also went around places to record. I took a lot of public transport that I have always been taking in Athens. And for those of you living in Athens know how long it takes to wait for the bus, get in the bus, and also, yeah, it's a place where every single means of transport is a micrography of the society in a way, and also, of course, Greek-speaking people, or in Athens, people tend to be quite loud. So when you're in a bus, there is really like a lot happening. So it's kind of similar idea with being on the market. A lot of voices, a lot of temporalities, etc. And then, Yeah, and then the other place I chose was the train connecting Athens to Piraeus, because I thought this would be a way to open up towards maybe the rest of the country, or maybe like a bigger overture, I don't know the word, yeah, towards the port, for instance. That could be another interesting place for soundscapes. Yeah, so these were a few ideas, and of course the neighborhoods where I lived before I moved abroad, which is Abelokipi, and it is a neighborhood that is surrounded by very big institutions such as the Central Police Office, the court, and then the social housing that were built for the refugees in 1922. So this is kind of the methodology that I followed to do the recordings. But yeah, I don't know if I'm being too long, John.
One quick question, sorry to,
Yeah.
Maria will obviously come to kind of the performing of this script that you developed through these recordings, but I just wanted to ask you both kind of, what were you looking for, I suppose? Like what kind of language, what kind of like relationships were you trying to pick up on when you were recording?
From my side, since I have been also researching on oral histories, storytelling, and also how economies of knowledge production are built in certain areas and certain moments where women gather. I think it was a bit intuitive in a way. I mean, there's of course a background, there is a theoretical frame, there are some tools, there are some discussions. But when I was walking around, sometimes I could grasp an amazing conversation that would be just blowing up the whole work. But then I was too late. I was not close enough. I was not. So yeah, it's not always how you plan it to be. But I think what I try to do is put myself inside it. So I was just recording myself and doing my daily transactions as a relatively young woman in the city, and how and also measure a little bit the impact of it. So I had a few conversations with elder women in the market, where we would be offered different things and where would be addressed in a different way. So I could see how a man would address me to sell something, and how he would address an older woman. But also, yeah, different situations, sometimes not explicitly related to women's voices, but let's say the soundscape and the architecture that forms the woman's voice, or that lets some space for the voices. And yeah, another element that I took a lot in consideration, that we have been discussing with Mercedes since the beginning, is the age. Maybe we can go back to it later. We gave a specific, yeah?
Just one thing to add here, Angeliki, but indeed, I mean, the different things, or to also add to the response to John, the different things that we were looking into, what we were hearing in Spanish is, they can call it la historicidad de una voz, which would be a dirty translation would be the historicity of a voice. So let's say the history that a voice kind of embodies, or history, memory, genealogies. And I think that that's something, in a way, we were looking into things that we would be hearing. I mean, Angeliki on behalf of the two of us, but things that could negotiate content, but also what I mean by this history of the voice, or historicity, the wrong word for it, but historicity of that voice, and at the same time, so content, but at the same time, a lot of banal elements and features, banal, like rhythms and cadences and things that we could use to build the script, knowing that we were going to work with Maria, that it's a performer, artist, performer, but also musician. So also, I think we were, and especially Angeliki had this this responsibility of making all these concessions and negotiations whenever she was choosing something that could bring certain content, certain history that voice was carrying, and at the same time certain rhythm, right? Like not if something was kind of dry or we wouldn't actually pick it, or we wouldn't. So it was a combination of formal elements and all these, as I said, all these layers, genealogies, memories, histories that a certain voice carries.
And then you passed the script to Maria, and for the project, we should obviously say that if people are watching on the City Talks Back site, then we're in the live room, but all of the rest of the works that are created at this stage, this kind of interim stage between gathering together again in Athens next year, hopefully, to perform and bring to life all of these works in different ways. But all of the kind of works at this kind of gathering stage, this assembly online in the rest of the site. But you all work together, you perform together a kind of reading of this script. And Maria, it was, if I'm right, it was the first time you kind of came into contact with these voices and these histories. You hadn't kind of been there at the point of recording, and we've spoken a bit before the panel about kind of the experience of meeting, I suppose, those people through these kinds of translations also, because we should say some of the text is Greek, some of it's English, it's been translated, and it's not necessarily what people said. It's also, as you've just explained, Mercedes, it's kind of the rhythms of the way people speak and the kinds of, I don't know, the kinds of structures, perhaps, of language that they use.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, what was really interesting about the project was that actually it all started with an email correspondence, because I was trying to track down today when was the first time we kind of got into talking about it. And it was in February that I have received this email from Angeliki asking me if I know a performer that uses voice in Athens. So we had this conversation, and then somehow we ended up talking that there is this coincidence with Mercedes, that we have both worked around this French artist. So it kind of all came very organically, and we started very quickly like talking about the project and deciding to collaborate. And I'm very grateful, because it's been a very relief. It's been a big relief during this time to have that kind of like a practice a little bit of reading online, which was also very meditative, because we did perform, the three of us. So I didn't perform the work on my own. We performed, the three of us, and it was a beautiful exchange. And also it was a very nice kind of passing over of an archive of recordings that I had no idea about it. I mean, it was just all these recordings, I think 30 or 35 tracks of different locations with very different qualities of sound, with a lot of different conversations. And then through this archive of recordings, I was actually, it was unveiling Angeliki's embodied experience of the city of Athens in the different places that she has been, and what was attracting her to record, you know, what she was interested in recording and why. So I was following a reversed, let's say, process of trying to understand what the project was about, and also approaching voice, I think, as, you know, both as logos, so as speech, as essence as well, but also as subjectivity. So the role of women, you know, came in as something that was there, but then it was there through its absence somehow. So that triggered a lot of my kind of practice as well, in terms of I have a more like ethnographic approach to performance. So I'm looking a lot at these practices of voicing through different rituals, and the absence in voicing these things is it's something very let's say common. Yeah. So yeah, I spend a lot of time of like listening the recordings and trying to understand well, what is the essence, like where do we focus, and then the script. I mean, Mercedes and Angeliki worked on the script, and I just received a beautiful script that very well written and very poetic and very layered, and so also the process of dividing the parts and deciding who's going to say what, I really enjoyed that. And I think every time we read together, it was almost like, it was like doing like a physical activity, like something meditative and something actually physical. So that was really nice. The other part that I really liked a lot about the recordings was that the way Angeliki approached the different ages, and the way, like for example, there were these extracts of that I put in the recording that we did in the reading like 1 month ago. So there were these women that they were going to the market, and they had this trolley, and then the wheel has broken, and they were trying to find a solution of what to do now. They can't go to the market, and then they just sat down and they were chatting. So there was this very, like how to say, not labeling what's going on, but how the type of conversation you would hear on a public space for women on this age is not something that you come across very easily, So it was just underlining or shedding light on like things that you wouldn't be able to listen otherwise. And also it was like as if Angeliki was like somehow revealing her diary to me, like it was a kind of sonic diary, because sometimes he was there as a journalist, and sometimes he was there like really as an observer in the recording. So that was creating a very interesting as well positioning in terms of what you allow to hear and what you kind of look for in terms of how do you prepare the ground for it to be heard. I think more or less this is the general kind of process of the recordings and then the reading, and I'm really looking forward to see as well how the work is going to develop.
Is it a good moment perhaps sorry, Mercedes?
No, just, two things. That it's a good moment for us to maybe read a tiny bit of it. And at the same time, I wanted to say that we continue this working process to a certain extent until next summer. I mean, next June, hopefully, when we are physically meeting in Athens, if things go well. But it's also interesting in terms of methodology, how we worked on location, on site, then we moved online, we composed online, we edited online, partly online, partly not, we rehearsed online as well, we performed for the camera during the pandemic. We are now having this conversation also.
Yes, and I wanted to say that, excuse me, Mercedes, that for me, it was also the first time that I worked in this format and also develop and present the work online. That was the first time that like it had a full kind of progress, the work.
So that was also, I mean, that it's also interesting when it comes to maybe connect or that it is possible in a way, given the distances, the differences within cultures, possibilities, language barriers. Like it was a type of project that facilitated a very interesting encounter among us, with the city of Athens, while being very away from it in a way, while being again this year in 2020, in the middle of this pandemic, and it's been a very interesting learning process that we kind of also can continue. But yeah, maybe it's good if we read a tiny bit of the script. It will be like a lo-fi reading because, of course, we want to include sound clips that we have and that Maria has edited out of the collected sounds. But yeah, maybe it's an example, a bit of an example of the script. Maybe you want to start, Maria?
Ψύχα αμυγδάλου, βαλεριάνα, δάφνη, θρούμπι, μείγμα πολίτικο, μπούκοβο, μαστίχα, σουμάκ. Ψύχα αμυγδάλου, βαλεριάνα, δάφνη, θρούμπι, μείγμα πολίτικο, μπούκοβο, μαστίχα, σουμάκ. Ψύχα αμυγδάλου, βαλεριάνα, δάφνη, θρούμπι, μείγμα πολίτικο, μπούκοβο, μαστίχα, σουμάκ, κανέλα, γαρίφαλο, ζάταρ, λουίζα, πασιφλόρα.
Open your lips, but do not open them simply. We, you, I are never open or closed. You, I are always several at the same time. We, you, I speak from that space in between, that space, that narrow space, that interval that lets itself be heard. Measure your steps according to their need or lack of need, for their own image. 1 or 2 steps, 1 or 2 steps, no more, without exuberance or turbulence. Is the street still where we can resist? Is that voice, the space, that space in between, that space, that narrow space, that interval where our inside and outside merge? Somewhere between the body and language, somewhere without being either, but perhaps both at the same time.
Once done with the spices, the sun is up and burning. Όμορφη πόλη, όμορφα καίγεται. Athens is burning and we're walking through the crowd. We're in safe places now. The herbs are there, but where and what is the fruit of our lives? Lives entangled among boiled vegetables and waxed fruit. We are all in all welcomed every 30 to 40 seconds, but her experienced sparkling eyes catch all the prices, the colors and textures. I'm following. Impossible to feel unobserved, a young girl is shopping next to us. Shy and confused by the noise, her voice is barely perceptible. She's offered all kinds of fruits, especially the ones arriving in freezer trucks after crossing oceans. She seems to be aware of that.
Is the voice that space? Είναι η φωνή αυτός ο χώρος? That space in between. Ανάμεσα. That space, that narrow space. Αυτός ο στενός χώρος. That interval where our inside and outside merge. Όπου το έξω και το μέσα συναντιούνται. Somewhere between the body and language. Κάπου ανάμεσα στο σώμα και στη γλώσσα. Somewhere between. Κάπου ανάμεσα. Without being either, but perhaps. Χωρίς να είναι κανένα, αλλά και τα δύο ταυτόχρονα. Without being either, but perhaps both at the same time.
Thank you. I haven't interrupted you, have I?
No.
Okay, good. Yeah, I wanted to bring in a little reading as well, partly because I think it connects it to other there's a lot of what you're talking about kind of in this. It was also one of the readings that we kind of put together or proposed for the residency, but also I think in terms of reading, there's something in connecting to the topic of our discussion, there's something very interesting about speaking other people's words, and there's this very interesting set of problematics about speaking other people's words as well, I suppose, and maybe afterwards we can kind of really come on to that and some of the questions we've talked about around responsibility and who kind of who disappears, I suppose, in that process. But anyway, I wanted to read a little bit from Nick Couldry, who is a media theorist working in the UK, who speaks about voice as a process. By voice as a process, I shall mean, as already suggested, the process of giving an account of one's life and its conditions, what philosopher Judith Butler calls giving an account of oneself. To give such an account means telling a story, providing a narrative. It's not often, perhaps, that any of us sits down to tell a story with a formal beginning and end. But at another more general level, narrative is a basic feature of human action. He goes on to give certain kind of principles of voice as a process, and I just selected a couple. I'm reading extracts. Voice is socially grounded. Voice is not the practice of individuals in isolation. This is for two reasons. First, voice depends on many prior conditions. Above all, the shared resources of material life and the specifically social resources, including but not limited to language, that enable and sustain practices of narrative. Having a voice requires resources, both practical resources, language, and the seemingly purely symbolic status necessary if one is to be recognized by others as having a voice. Both are part of the materiality of voice, the matter without which voice is impossible. Like most matter, they are unevenly distributed. Voice is a form of reflexive agency. A key part of the voice's agency is reflexivity. Since taking responsibility for one's voice involves telling an additional story of oneself as the person who did say this or do that, voice necessarily involves us in an ongoing process of reflection, exchanging narratives back and forth between our past and present selves, and between us and others. This process is not accidental, but necessary. Humans have a desire to narrate, as Adriana Cavarero puts it, a desire to make sense of their lives. Voice is an embodied process. The voice of each are embodied history. This results from the relation between voice and action. It follows that voice is irreducibly plural. Even if the resources on which each voice draws are inherently social, the trajectory of each voice is different. Since voice involves the reflexive narrative trajectory of an individual, it cannot be read off at a distance. For voice is the process of articulating the world from a distinctive embodied position. Failing to respect the inherent differences between voices means once again failing to recognize voice at all. Voice requires a material form which may be individual, collective, or distributed. It's another principle of his. The material form of voice cannot in any case be exclusively individual. We do not generate the means by which we narrate. We emerge as subjects into pluralism or disregarding the importance of collective forms of action. Defending voices of value simply means defending the potential of voices anywhere to matter. If through an unequal distribution of narrative resources, the materials from which some people must build their account of themselves are not theirs to adapt or control, then this represents a deep denial of voice. A deep form of oppression. This is the oppression W.B. Du Bois described as a double consciousness, a sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Voice is a continuing process of reflecting back and forth between actions, experiences, and thought, an open-ended process of giving an account in which each person is engaged. Yeah, so I think there's something in there really about you mentioned the kind of historicity and like the fact that we kind of narrate and puts our position at this moment into a kind of like a trajectory, a kind of historical trajectory that we can construct ourselves. And he also speaks about this idea of voice being is not necessarily collective in that it's one thing, it's kind of distributed. It's that we collectively build the resources through which one another can speak. And so I just think that is very interesting in terms of this idea of scripting as a kind of distributed way of recording and then re-speaking. And I guess in Theatrum Mundi, we have a project on cultural infrastructure. We have a broad interest in thinking through infrastructure and its relationships to culture. And one, in a way, kind of not framed as part of that, but in my mind, very much connected, is a project about scores and scoring. And I think kind of infrastructures, scores, and scripts are kind of an interesting, somehow interrelated set of phenomena that underpin the kind of construction of the narratives and the phenomena and the cultural, the cultural products, for want of a better word, that we see. But they're not the kind of finished thing. They can be handed on and kind of used in a different way. A script can be read in different ways, through different voices, in different rooms, through the resonances of those rooms. It can be staged differently. A score can be kind of put in the hands of so many different people whose kind of embodied knowledge transform it into something else. So I think but then within that is a question of where is the author of that, and where is the kind of, I mean, you're the author of the script, but you kind of have a distributed authorship to some, obviously, with the people who you recorded. And so when we kind of use an infrastructure, the infrastructure also becomes invisible a lot of the time by using it. And, the script that you just read was not visible to us. We encounter your words, but the script is kind of where it's the touch point, I suppose, between the people who you recorded and then the words you speak now. So I guess I'm coming around to kind of asking a question to everyone, or for us to discuss about where is the kind of, where are those people whose voices are in that script, in that moment of performance? That's a question you raised, I think, Mercedes, when we were discussing this panel, kind of, yeah. And how can we think about a script as this kind of infrastructure for sharing the work of voicing and hearing others' voices through ourselves in a way that kind of can be a meaningful and important connection between those different bodies and people?
Yeah, well, a lot of things to touch on here, but I think it's, I was just taking some notes when you were reading. First of all, I just wanted to mention this idea of you, that you read the voice as a socially grounded element, or something that actually socially ground us. And that's on one side very much related to what I was saying in regards to the historicity of a voice, right? And at the same time, collecting all these voices and soundscapes and noises, it really does come following Adriana Cabarero's desire to narrate. So there is a desire to narrate behind such drive of going into the city, collecting, transcribing. Angeliki did that fantastic job, which is transcribing from Greek and then translated into English, explaining to me idioms and ways of speaking and slang from the street and different generational or different ways to say certain things. So there was all the time behind this desire to narrate, to tell a story, and at the same time, at least for me, right, like I didn't want to land in Athens or in the market, in the Greek market, and kind of extract something and then run away with it and put together a script and So for me, it was important that from the very beginning, this was a collective practice where locally engaged artists were involved in a way, in this case of Maria and Angeliki. And throughout the process, this is a few questions, kind of more difficult questions arose, which is, okay, we are embodying these voices, but when we are speaking and when we are embodying these different, when we are kind of channeling these different voices, who are we silencing at the same time? What position we take as artists visiting another city nearby, coming into a marking, collecting all these voices / extracting all this material, leaving this place, working elsewhere, editing, reshuffling the material, recomposing, re-embodying, performing, voicing, but then who are we silencing at the same time in this type of practices? And that was, I mean, it's a question that it stayed with me after this practice, after this process, and it's a question that I don't have a full answer for it in a way, but that it was important to acknowledge that. I don't know if it's clear what I'm.
Yeah, I mean, I think though that what's for me really interesting in the approach of recording and then transcribing and translating is that you weren't trying to kind of just present someone's voice and say, this is Athens, this is the voices of Athens. Like, this would be possibly too much responsibility, irresponsible to kind of to choose, you know, for you to choose people who can become those spokespeople. You created your own words, I suppose, this script, but you allowed yourselves to kind of become influenced by what you heard. And that process of recording and then transcribing and then translating is like hearing once live, hearing again, listening to the recordings, hearing again when you transcribe. It's a process of paying very deep attention. And I suppose we all hear and speak from a specific embodied position, but so much of what we hear, I suppose, passes us by so much. So this script seems to me like a way of like holding, somehow kind of catching and holding on to these things that come to your ears in a certain moment and kind of transforming and translating them into your own voice, but through a lot of care and attention. Not to kind of say there isn't problematics and to say, you know, obviously I think your work is fantastic, but I do think that this is why I find it interesting, because it proposes a particular thing of kind of saying, well, we're going to record in order to hear and pay attention, but we're not going to kind of present that recording. We're going to then go through all these layers of transformation so that you kind of, it becomes your voice, but then you're also kind of acknowledging a relationship between that and these things that have been heard.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I mean, it's an interesting tension where it happens, which is caring for something and caring for whatever is going on in the market, caring for this older generation of women that mingle in the market and have their own way of speaking and their own way of moving, but at the same time collecting that. And when we're back in the studio, back at home, let's say, working together, being a bit irreverent with that material. So that's something that it's kind of an interesting tension that I think that we are doing here, which is caring for something or putting attention into something and saying, okay, we want to narrate about this story, or we want to choose this particular story, but at the same time treating the material like entering into such into such a layered way of translating and rewriting and translating and rewriting that it deforms in itself, and it becomes, it loses certain aura or pristine nature that it might have. It's not pure anymore. It's treated with certain irreverency, if there is such a word. And I think that's important to keep into these type of practices. But at the same time, this tension, it brought other questions, as I was mentioning before. It's like, okay, what do we lose in the middle, or what do we never grasp from the very beginning? Maybe we're never really picking up these voices. What we're hearing, it's never, or we're picking up something, but by picking up something, we're leaving a whole bunch of other voices out of it. So yeah, just a lot of open questions. I don't know, maybe Angeliki, Maria have something to add into it, but
yes, I have semi-practical note to add that the translation process actually of these recordings, since they were mainly in the markets, was completely impossible. Like the impossibility of the translation of the recordings adds, I think, something to what you're saying, John, that is not just, and Mercedes, not just taking the words and just transcribing them, and then of course listening to it again and then translating it. But I remember the moment I had to translate all the dialogues. It just didn't make any sense. Like because it's so hard to translate. It's not a text. It's not a clear dialogue. There's a lot of expressions, as Mercedes said, that is that older women use, or that my grandmother would use to kick out the bad eye, the spirits. And of course, there are some cultures, there are many cultures or other languages where you can find similar things. But this went like in a very non-linear, chaotic way. And I think also the fact that, as Mercedes mentioned, she has this experience from Buenos Aires, and she has also this work and performative work in her background of approaching the markets. This created even more layers. So yeah, of course you appropriate or use someone's words, but then there is a whole lot of mix of things happening at the same time. Yeah, that's it.
Maria, I remember you were talking a lot. I was really caught by, you were talking about kind of communion, I think, and communing through, when we were kind of discussing the panel. Like,
yes.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly what I was saying.
Okay.
It was a while ago, but do you remember maybe?
I can't remember. Someone like an anthropologist you had been.
Oh yes, that's right. Yeah, I remember. Yes. Yeah, I mean, in relation to what you guys were saying, also to just make a link somehow to this absence, or who are we are not letting be heard. I was recently reading this very interesting anthropological research in Malaysia, in the free trade like regions of Malaysia, when you had like during the 70s and the 80s, you had all these like factories of electronics that they were like created there. So in the factories, you had a lot of very young like women, Malaysian women, that they were going to work. So they were literally taken out of the countryside and they were starting to work directly into the factory. So you can imagine the shock of like the transition into a factory life from the country, and what that meant for them in terms of their sexuality, of their social status. And so what they have done that I found very interesting is that they created this like collective, let's say, possession. So they have arranged, in order to fight an extremely capitalist and horrible like system in the factory, that they are going to somehow orchestrate, create like a ritualized rebellion somehow. And I think it happened several times in different factories, where you had like at some point 120 young women like entering into trance, being possessed from this evil spirit that has taken over the factory. So their voices would be altered. Suddenly you had 120 factory workers that started screaming, that the personnel from the factory didn't know how to deal with that. They were fainting. They were using a lot of like force to break things, and they had to take them out of the factory. They had to cleanse the factory with a magician that had to slaughter a goat and like do all these actual rituals that they were taking like a very long time. So what was interesting to read about her was that you could never hear the voice of the spirit that they were possessed from. So you could never hear the actual spirit like talking. But what is very interesting is that the anthropologist that is like actually has written very much about them is saying that they have found their own voice. So they have created that in order to voice an injustice, oppression in their life as women, as workers, I think, I mean, it's a good example to think of voice as something that is not just like that. You can also voice something through the absence of saying it somehow. So I don't know if it's clear, the example.
Well, for me, it's so interesting because it speaks a lot to this idea of distribution of voice, the idea of being possessed by another or a kind of collective or another speaking through you. And obviously in this example, they used that because of the kind of disempowerment of their own voices. This idea of possession empowered them because it was more, you become kind of more than yourself by speaking the words of another. And I mean, to some degree, I think we could talk about performance as this, and the aura of performance is also something around that moment of possession by something kind of beyond the embodied narrative and that's built up in your own self, like the expansion of the self that can come through performance as a kind of state of being, I suppose. Like that's, I think, somehow in all of that, it is again what interests me a lot about scripts, because they kind of give you something to do that with. They're an infrastructure to allow for this expansion of the self via kind of, you know, I played Bach on the saxophone because like it was, yeah, I don't know, like when in my music degree, because something about like those particular notes brought out the resonance of the instrument. And I don't know, like if I was just playing on my own, I couldn't kind of bring it out in that way. It's like an enabling thing for this possession by someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, yeah, I don't know, like there's something in that thing of speaking on behalf of other people versus being possessed by others or an absence or a kind of collective somehow, that I think is quite an
and a lot that has to do with agency, I think, because you mentioned a lot that word, and I think it's very important. Like also while working together, you know, the agency that we had on the script and on also like you know, dealing with care with what was said, or how, you know, we would treat the recordings, or there was never very intimate. There were some intimate recordings. I mean, the young girls that they were talking about, their literally, I think their sex life in the metro, I think, right? And yeah, I mean, there is an intimacy there, but because there is an anonymity as well, it becomes this very open space to somehow we can have the agency to use that, you know. So we give ourselves that we can allow ourselves to have that role. Mm-hmm. So that's also something very interesting with the recordings and the anonymity of this, how it makes what is said quite, I don't want to say universal, but somehow it just puts it on the table in a very like democratic way. Yeah.
I mean, in your other, like some of your other performance work, Mercedes, it seems to me there's quite an intense sense of possession of also people you've heard that you don't know, and you don't even know what they're saying necessarily.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. To me, performing, it's always connected with certain state of transformation. So it is a moment of possession, a moment of communion. Maybe it can be even a spiritual moment. You know, it depends what type of theme I'm working with, or person, maybe, right? Or like, yeah, even, I mean, I had many years ago, I did a performance based on the recordings from all the Skype's conversations I had with my grandmother that passed away already. Well, soon 2 years. I think this weekend is 2 years, and it was almost like speaking with her, with the dead person. You know? So it was almost like a spiritual type of encounter. But I liked what Maria said, that it's true. I mean, it brings certain responses to my question of who are we silencing, and at the same time with this script in particular, for example, in Athens, in the markets, but that we can still configure our voice through the script, and acknowledging those absences at the same time. Like that, I think that it was important for me throughout the process to understand that there were absences in this. Of course, there are always absences, right? But that we were kind of building or constructing something through subtraction in a way, or rather than adding voices, we were kind of sculpting by subtracting in a way. And because we collected a lot of material, and then we were editing and subtracting, but also how how those absences also sculpted the script. I don't know if it's very well articulated, but it's
is it just to kind of try and like rephrase it, is it something about, because it's based around subtraction and absence, it's never pertaining to be, it's never presenting itself as a kind of totality also? By creating something, by taking away, you're kind of acknowledging also the like incompleteness of everything.
Thank you, always, John, bringing the spine of our spine. No, but indeed, it's that's how I would put it in a way, that pointing out into that never completeness, and
if I can try to kind of like, because we kind of have been here for just over an hour, to try to bring towards a conclusion by linking it back to, well, the whole thing's been contextualized and grounded in Athens, in a city, and therefore in kind of urbanity as a kind of type of environment. But also Theatrum Mundi's aim is somehow to kind of support this type of experimentation and research in order to bring in different energies and different languages into the way that we understand, or that we work in urbanism as a kind of broad set of professional practices as well. And what I see as so limited in that space is the way that people are kind of invited to speak into particular processes of urban decision-making, planning, etc. Like, I mean, to be very basic about it, like community engagement or consultation. I mean, I've been in, kind of like helped with so many of these things, and you have these posters, and people like come and maybe write a post-it note. I would like to have a swimming pool. I would like to have a playground in this, you know, like it's kind of the type of communication that can be dealt with in that space is so limited. You were talking, Angeliki, about like even the difficulty when you actually go outwards from a space in which you're staging a very specialist type of communication to discuss transformation in the city, and you actually go out into the spaces of people's everyday experience and hear the way people talk. The languages, the disconnect between those languages is so much, and I don't think the idea is ever to kind of instrumentalize or say that an artistic process like this might have in itself the answer. But I think what it does propose is such a kind of this and different kinds of a diversity of artistic practices propose different ways of hearing, of noticing, of like, you know, not just kind of surveying people on the street, or I don't know, kind of very traditional democratic processes of giving people a voice, handing the microphone and saying, what do you think about this? Which is kind of put such a, you hand someone a voice in a given place and time for a certain reason. But what this speaks to for me is, a valuing of everyday speech, a valuing of listening to that, a valuing of kind of, a layered transformation into something that you can then say without claiming that it fully represents what you heard. And also, I mean, you know, to even talk about spirituality within a context like that would be completely kind of people wouldn't know what to kind of do with it, I suppose. But to start to reframe these ideas like Nick Coldry's of distributed voice as actually a kind of spiritual communion of possession and feeling people and people who are not here anymore, or speaking through yourself through these different means, I think is very kind of, I don't quite know how to put it back into that world, but it's so exciting to me as a kind of challenge to that notion of how limited the forms of self-narration and collective narration are that go on within those discussions about kind of what should the city be, what is it to you, what's meaningful to you, you know, which happens so much through ways that are not instantly kind of translatable, that require perhaps a few stages of decoding and close listening in order to kind of give value to in that setting. I don't know whether it's possible to speak back to that at all, but yeah, I welcome you too if you have any final thoughts.
I think it was wonderfully said, John.
Thanks. You flatter me.
I just want to add that it's been really a lot of fun to do this together, all of us, with Angeliki and Maria, but also John, Theatrum Mundi, and the people from Onassis, Stegi, and the whole experience of the City Talks Back. But I think there was like an underlying joy connected to the project, or connected to to this experience. And I always rescue that, always like kind of above everything, that we can still find enjoyment and satisfaction and laugh and in every moment throughout the process of of course, being in Athens is just fantastic, and it's such a vibrant,
it's complicated.
But it's just as an outsider, it's such a vibrant experience, right? But just the capacity and the possibility we had to sustain that vibrancy, or that that vibrant feeling throughout this process.
Well, thank you. If any of you are still with us, thank you to all of the rest of the amazing residency group and the other collaborators that different people from the group invited in. Again, just to give a promo, all of whose works are on the backtalks.city site, which you may be watching on, or perhaps if this is posted later. And yeah, I hope that there will be further conversations that kind of branch out of those works. The plan is to have occasional discussions, critical thinking, branching out of these different creations and the different experiences we had during those residencies that will be going on this site. And yeah, I mean, as you say, there's lots more for us to do, and it's so nice to have these in amongst this situation that we live in, to kind of put a bracket around time and just spend an hour talking and not sending any emails. Or so it's really nice to, and really important, yeah, to kind of create these moments to think in a focused way together about what these projects mean as well. So thank you for taking the time to do that. Angeliki, any last thoughts?
Comments? I have one comment. Today, yeah, as most of you know, is the International Day Against Women's Violence. So it feels also very important to have this conversation, even if it's a tiny, tiny, tiny part of it. But yeah, I just wanted to note this coincidence as I started talking about coincidences.
In so many complicated ways, being part of global moments from the isolation of our homes or studios in different ways. So yeah, it's good to kind of and important to be to keep talking in different settings. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching if you're still here, and good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Ciao.